Welcome to Bitcoin Fixes This, where we explore the impact that Bitcoin will have in all aspects of society. Today's guest is Florian, mixed martial artist and UFC commentator. We talk about innovation, understanding new technology, and decision making. Kenny also tells us about how he got into mixed martial arts, how he got into Bitcoin, and the similarities he sees between the rise of both. Kenny's success in the octagon is no accident. He's not just an amazing fighter, but a deep thinker. The surprising thing for me in this interview was Kenny's optimistic view of the world and his unshakable belief in the creativity of the human spirit. I found my conversation uplifting, and his mindset is something well worth learning. I hope you enjoyed this interview. Kenny Florian, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're up in Boston, right? How are things over there with COVID and everything?
So actually, I'm originally from Boston. I was there in Boston till about 2000. I was there till the end of 2011. I moved to Los Angeles in 2012 and have been there ever since. Currently, I'm in South Carolina with my wife's family, kind of hanging out with my family over here. So I'm in the process of moving. So I'm looking for a new city in the next few months. So yeah.
Okay. What are your candidates? I imagine this has something to do with COVID. You're moving and all that.
Yeah, no, definitely. Los Angeles has been a little crazy. So, I think I have an expanding family. So, I think we just need a little bit more space. I think a little bit more freedom and, I think a little less craziness, I think. So, so yeah, just looking to, for a new city, looking maybe in the Nashville area. So that's one of the candidates. So I'm going to kind of take the next few months with my family to scout out these places and see if it's a good fit.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. So big changes going on in your life. You got more kids, moving and everything else. All right. So a lot of people don't know that you're into Bitcoin, and that's one of the reasons why I'm having you on this podcast. So can you tell us the story of how you got into it and so on?
Definitely. I think the first time I heard about Bitcoin was around maybe 2013. I was just kind of being aware of, different news and different things like that. And, a friend of mine had told me about Bitcoin and a little bit about what it does and, the potential and all that stuff. And, I didn't really, get it. I feel like I'm still trying to understand it the best that I can. And each time I feel like there's a new revelation about Bitcoin that kind of gets me excited. But so originally I think I purchased my first Bitcoin in around like 2015, I believe.
Wow.
And to me, originally, if I'm being completely candid, it was more about, hey, maybe this thing works and I make some money. It wasn't about like, oh, this is like this amazing technology. I just wasn't aware of it. And, I understood the potential for it and how it was cool and kind of redefining money and what we see as money and kind of fighting back against kind of what happened in 2008 with the banks. But that really, if I'm being honest, really wasn't my motivation at the time. I think as I did more research and was learning about it and playing around with some of the other cryptocurrencies like Ethereum, and I was just continuing to educate myself and on the internet, so learning as much as I could. And each time it kind of got me thinking more and more. And I think when you come across something, technology specifically, that gets you to ask a lot of questions and point you in some interesting directions, I think there's some beautiful artistry there. So I just kind of been trying to continually educate myself about it. And I kind of been accumulating more and more of it. And I'm excited for the future and for the potential of the technology and to see so many different players, large and small, come into the fold. I think is an exciting time in human history, really, to be honest.
Yeah, and it sounds like you got in an interesting time. 2015 was like the absolute like bear market
Yeah.
in that cycle. So, I mean, tell me more about like what happened there. Like, who were you reading something? Did somebody convince you to like open an account somewhere? What was
Yeah.
the impetus?
Yeah, my friend, I think originally when I heard about it, I think Bitcoin was at like $70, and I was
Mm,
about to put a few $1,000s and just like, all right, let's see what happens. But
mm,
I had a lot on my plate at the time. I was working a lot for Fox Sports, and
mm,
um, had recently traveled to Los Angeles. I had a couple homes in Boston, and I was renting in LA. So I just kind of had a lot going on, and just wasn't able to really do it for whatever reason. And it wasn't such an easy thing, I guess, for me, anyways, to just go out there and buy Bitcoin.
mm.
You can't just go to your local street corner and be like, oh, I want to buy Bitcoin or your market. So, all that stuff. Anyways, it kind of pushed me back. And eventually, around 2015, I think I looked at the price of Bitcoin. It was like maybe like 250s or something like that. Like, and I was like, whoa, how did how did this happen? Like, wait, people are really kind of onto this, and that got me interested. And then eventually, I think I bought Bitcoin. I think it was in 2015. It was either something like Coinbase or
Mm,
some other online thing. And so
mm,
I started, accumulated a little bit at the time, and then started accumulating a little bit more, and just kind of was reading about it as much as I could, and trying to understand exactly what the implications of it were, and kind of what you can do with it, and what the potential of it was.
Wow. So I mean that's fairly early. I mean, as far as like people in the crypto community
I
are concerned, you're an OG.
I don't know. I mean, I guess I was an ignorant OG,
Mhm,
but I think that I guess I'm like kind of the eternal optimist. I think my dad is very much like that, and I, I I I thought it was very interesting that here was this technology that we were kind of responsible for in its success or failure. And
mm,
that was kind of exciting to me that, for the first time in a very, very, very long time, humans kind of could control their destiny in a certain way of, controlling this digital currency or this digital monetary system, which I thought was really interesting. And I, at the time, I don't think I had a whole lot of faith in it. I just kind of was excited about it and liked the potential of it. And over time, I've become, um, I've just had a lot more faith in it, and it's just been a really interesting ride.
mm. You mentioned your dad and how he's an eternal optimist. I was reading earlier about your background and stuff, and he's from Peru, right?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. He's a thoracic and cardiovascular surgeon that ended up in the Boston area from Lima, Peru, and yeah, he was just kind of this always this go getter, and worked really hard, and kind of passed on the idea of working hard, and being a positive person, and believing in yourself, and investing in yourself and betting on yourself repeatedly. And I think that's kind of I think if you're into Bitcoin, I think you're more of an optimist than anything else. That
Mm.
you kind of have this idea that we can kind of overturn and change this system that we're currently in that has failed us repeatedly.
Mm. Yeah, have you talked to your dad about Bitcoin? Because I'm curious on his perspective, having grown up in Peru and so on. I
Yes,
know they've had currency collapses and so on.
absolutely. And we have talked about it. I think that for him, and I think a lot of people, I think in a way, well, first of all, just being in the system for so long and not kind of seeing outside of it, I think he is a little bit hesitant. I think
Mm.
people at the end of the day kind of like the idea of being able to point the finger in a lot of ways at central banks, or and say, well, you guys screwed this up, and you're going to be able. The problem is that we don't have the power to do anything really about that, at
Mm,
the end of
mhm,
the day. So I think that, yeah, he's interested in it, and I've been trying to get him to invest in it for a very long time. But I think that at his age, in his 80s now, I think he's kind of locked into a certain mentality where there's some trepidation there in him kind of making that first step and kind of diving in. And I tell him, it's like, you don't need to buy even a full Bitcoin. Like, get a half a Bitcoin, get a couple Bitcoin, whatever it is. You don't have to get some crazy position, but I think it's way better, especially how it's positioned now, to have a little bit as opposed to zero.
Yeah, I know for myself, it took me like 4 years before my dad bought it. I told him in 2013, he just absolutely refused.
Nice.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, I'm just a fan of yours from your UFC days. So I wanted to ask a few things about your background. I know you're a soccer player or like our international listeners might call it football.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're a soccer player at Boston College, and then you transitioned to the UFC. How did that happen? Like, I'm always curious.
I know, it's funny. I told people I went from being involved in like the wimpiest sport to the most brutal sport, pretending like I'm hurt to trying to hurt others. But yeah, I played soccer my whole life. I loved soccer and played all the way until I was in BC. And in watching the first UFC, I was just fascinated by, this martial arts spectacle, really, that, I think for someone who grew up, and I grew up, doing martial arts as well. My dad was also a black belt in judo and wanted us all to learn self-defense in some way, shape, or form. And, so I did it a lot when I was a kid and, had a lot of other things going on with sports. So I had to kind of leave it behind. But the first time I did martial arts, I felt like it was like a religious experience where I could just focus on that. And that was the only thing that existed in the world. And, I missed it. And when I saw the first UFC and I saw all these different martial arts styles competing against each other, it kind of answered a question that me and my brothers had while we were growing up. I'm one of 6 kids. I have 4 brothers and 1 sister. And, I was fascinated by the fact that all these martial artists from all over the world were competing to see who had the best style. And ultimately, after 3 or 4 UFCs, the style of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu had established itself as a dominant force, not in theory, not in talking about it, but in actually going out and doing it and proving it. And it was especially powerful because here was this skinny Brazilian guy who was beating these monsters. Back in the day, the UFC, they didn't have weight classes. And the fact that there was this lanky guy named Royce Gracie who was not only winning these fights, but winning them decisively, to me showed that there was a very powerful technology at play. And I wanted to learn that. And it was inspiring because I'm like, well, if that skinny guy can do it, and I'm a little skinny guy, maybe I could do it. And eventually, it kind of led me down a path of, eternal curiosity where okay, well, I've got some moves now. I can do this in a training room. What would happen if I did this in a competition and did it against another jiu-jitsu practitioner? Okay, and what would I do against another wrestler practitioner? So I would do all these different tournaments, and I ended up doing well, and started kind of getting outside of my area and having mixed success, and eventually getting better and better and competing, at a higher level. And ultimately, when I was about a brown belt, I started getting interested in maybe competing in just one mixed martial arts fight. That was my goal. I just wanted to know, okay, what would happen in a pressure situation where I would have to pit myself against another trained martial artist? What would happen? Would I freak out? Would I be able to defend myself? What would go down? So eventually, I think in 2003 or 2004, I had my first mixed martial arts fight. One fight became 2 fights and became 3 fights. And on my 4th fight, I fought a guy with an insane amount of experience. I think he had like 30 fights to my 3 fights. And we had an absolute war. It was probably the first time I'd ever been hit in the face. In the arena that night was Dana White, the president of the UFC. And, we had a war. I thought I won. He thought he won. And I lost a split decision in Boston. And Dana came back to my dressing room. He said, "Hey, kid, I thought you were going to get your ass kicked. We're doing this new show called The Ultimate Fighter. It's going to be filmed in Vegas. Would you be interested in participating in it?" And I was so upset that I lost the fight that I was like, yeah, whatever. And it didn't even faze me that Dana was there. I was just so upset that I lost. And Eventually, he said, like, listen, just have your brother interview you, send that in while producers will check it out. I ended up sending in like a seminar DVD of me teaching. And they called me, they invited me to Vegas. They told me I was going to be, in a weight class that was way above mine. I would be the least experienced guy. So would I still be down to do it? And I said, yeah, sure. Why not? Ended up doing that. Being the least experienced and being the smallest on the show, somehow I made it to the finals of the Ultimate Fighter season 1, and lost miserably in the final. It was a terrible performance. I was completely spooked and let fear take over. And it was that experience that said, okay, you know what? I'm going to actually try to be a professional fighter. Like before I didn't, that was not my goal. Now I don't want to lose on those terms. I feel like I beat myself, and I wanted to go out and do something that I was proud of and give it my best effort. And that's kind of what led me down the path to being a professional mixed martial arts fighter in the UFC.
Wow, wow. So many questions. What a story. It's just like you just came in. But I mean, you were really there for the explosion of the UFC. The Ultimate Fighter 1, at least for me. I mean, like when I saw the Bonner Griffin fight, like that was just like, I mean, everybody I know started watching UFC like right after that. It was like you can't get away from this. That was just so exciting and so much better than boxing, which I always thought was kind of boring. And where these guys are trying to kill each other, it was awesome. But yeah, one thing that you mentioned that I wanted to ask about is, when you first saw jiu-jitsu, you saw it as sort of like this. Like underrated technology that got to just sort of show itself, and I was thinking, wow, that's very similar to Bitcoin, isn't it?
Absolutely, man, absolutely. I think those things, when you start to see it and you see it in action and you see that it works, I think there's nothing more powerful than that. I think unless you're just stuck in the system and afraid to learn something new, and I think that's what I credit martial arts to so much, is that the truth will eventually come out. The truth will reveal itself. There is no hiding in the martial arts for the most part. I think the results of what happens out there when you test it is going to reveal itself, and you'll know what you need to work on and how you can strengthen the system. The system, of course, being jiu-jitsu. And I think the same thing can be said with Bitcoin. And you look at the kind of technology and how much quicker and more efficient and safer it is, in my opinion, than the current system. I think once you can get people to understand that, I think there's no looking back. And I think back in the UFC, I didn't know exactly what was going to happen with the UFC, but I did know the potential of it, and I did know that it was a very exciting sport that was misunderstood, that had a lot of potential. And I think as it stands right now, I think when you compare it to sports like boxing and other sports, I think, like you said, I think you realize how much more powerful it is, how much more exciting it is. And I think kind of we're in a similar situation with Bitcoin. I think it's still we're still in the very early stages of things. And we're already seeing a lot of exciting developments and a lot of, different, big time CEOs and some really smart people that are investing, either their company's money, their own personal money, or their time into Bitcoin.
Yeah, definitely. And things are taking off in the same way, sort of like UFC took off after the Ultimate Fighter. that to me is like sort of like a cultural moment that's sort of embedded into our history. One thing I wanted to touch on, you mentioned that it was like a weight class that was higher than what you were supposed to be. And I noticed during your career, you started out as like a middleweight on the Ultimate Fighter. And you ended as a featherweight. How does that happen? That's a lot of pounds to lose during a career. Like what happened there?
It is. It's crazy. I think I was infatuated, and still am, for sure, about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I've always believed that the true martial artist, that skill is the most important thing. Technique is the most important thing. And I think I was probably 175 pounds when I was fighting on the Ultimate Fighter, and I had gained weight up to like 182. And everyone else was cutting weight, from like 215 pounds, 200 pounds. So, but, in boxing and wrestling and mixed martial arts, when two masses are about to collide, the heavier one will have an advantage. And that's kind of where people come from with the weight cutting thing, that, that they will diet down or cut water weight, get on the scale, make weight, and then replenish themselves for next day's action. So you have at least 24 hours to replenish yourself and refuel. And that's what a lot of, fighters do. So I was definitely underweight. And, for me, I was like, well, we're going to find out if I'm a real martial artist or not. I'm going to be competing against guys way more experienced, way bigger than me. Let's see if I could pull it off. I think that advantage of technique goes away as people learn those same techniques. So I think it's an information game. And I think people forget about that martial arts to me is an information game. And I think the way so many things work, it's really an information game. It's what kind of information can I get a grasp on? What kind of information can I understand? What kind of information can I bring to the table to make things better? And I think it is very similar to a technology, martial arts. So I think being on the Ultimate Fighter at 185 pounds, I had to learn the hard way, and I learned a lot in that process, making mistakes and having some success. And then ultimately, after the Ultimate Fighter wrapped, the lightest weight class that the UFC had at the time was welterweight, 170 pounds. At the time, they had gotten rid of or didn't have those weight classes below 170 pounds. So I competed in 170 pounds a couple times, and then I eventually went down to 155 pounds when they brought that division to the UFC. And then I ended my career at 145 pounds, which was absolute insanity. 155 pounds, I definitely was cutting weight. I was kind of like around 172 pounds, had to cut down to 155. And then at 145 pounds, I had to cut an insane amount of weight and felt very, kind of weak and didn't really have a whole lot of strength on fight night, unfortunately. But, still was able to compete for 3 different world titles in 2 different weight classes, and still found some success and was able to compete against, a lot of great fighters in my time. And to me, I think, enjoying that process and learning and getting better as a martial artist was my ultimate goal. And, I think for that, I'm real thankful that I got a chance to test myself against some of the best fighters in the world.
Yeah, that thing that you said about it being an information game is really interesting to me, because in a sense, like, as fans, when we watch, it looks like a really fun sort of like just smash each other kind of thing. But I mean, like, the more I look at jiu-jitsu and all of the things that go into it and all of the striking and the feints and, like changing levels and all that stuff, it is sort of like a game of, okay, what can I figure out about the other person? Can you describe that process for me a little bit?
Absolutely. I think, I think a lot of people approach things and they try to know things. Like, I guess the way that I was trying to know things about Bitcoin, I was, kind of gathering some information and trying to know things, but I'm not sure I was really trying to understand things until like the last year or so. And I think it's been the same thing with my jiu-jitsu. I think I've been trying to go from just collecting moves and collecting techniques and collecting information to trying to understand it and trying to break it down the best that I can. So I think, okay, well, you have these other grappling arts like judo and jiu-jitsu and wrestling, and you have these other fighting arts like boxing and Muay Thai and kickboxing and, the various other styles. If we're kind of doing the same thing, what are the common aspects of those things that are uniting everything? So that's what kind of I was trying to look at was, okay, well, if there are certain takedowns that you use in all of grappling, and there's certain positional moves that you do in grappling, what is the glue? What is the stuff that is really making it work?
Right.
as opposed to just trying to collect moves and go, okay, well, I'm going to organize this system to combat this system and this system to combat that system. I tried to, what I've been trying to do with martial arts really, especially over the last couple of years, is trying to understand it to the point where I could explain it as simply as possible, and trying to unite a lot of the physical properties of physics, for example, and try to communicate what makes grappling work. And I think there's and having that information, I think, goes a lot further than the way that things are currently done in martial arts. I think you collect a bunch of moves, you kind of systematize it, and that's it. And then you kind of keep that until you need to kind of overhaul it. Whereas I think the way that I'm trying to look at it is, okay, here are the few simple concepts that make grappling work. We can go in and hack any system we want, and we can understand how every system works, and we can kind of teach ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds a lot like programming. You can learn how to code a particular thing, but until you really understand what's going on and can sort of create on the fly like what you need to do, that's it's you don't really have mastery.
Right. Exactly. And I think that's what I think I've been trying to achieve, and what always excited me about let's say watching martial arts movies as a kid. I was fascinated with the old masters and what they could achieve and what they could do. And I think there is so much of the stuff of the good stuff is invisible, is the stuff you can't see, and the stuff that people aren't talking about. Otherwise, everyone would be an expert. And as we know, I think there's not a whole lot of true experts, true masters out there. A lot of people claim they are, but I don't really see that. I think that the only way to be a master is to do something different than everybody else, I think.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought, because this is something that I talked about with another guest like a few episodes back. But there is sort of like an orthodoxy that that's like conventional wisdom or something, right? Like that people think is true, and then somebody new comes in and says, "Okay, you know what? That's not true," and I think I can take advantage of that because here are the flaws in it, and then they come and show it. Right?
Absolutely.
Do you see that in the UFC? I mean, I know there's been several generations of fighters, and each has done differently. Is that the process that by which the art improves?
Absolutely. And I think that we've seen that. It's like there's the guys that come in and are trying to do what everybody else is doing, and I feel like that's where the UFC is at right now. I think there's a lot of fighters that are just trying to be like everybody else, and everyone is kind of looking the same to me. But when you look at the elite, the top guys, they're doing things differently, either during the fight itself or in their preparations for the fight itself. And I think that looking outside of the box and bringing in new techniques and new approaches is what's going to throw people for a loop. If everyone's doing the exact same thing, it doesn't mean you're not a good fighter. You can be a very good fighter doing that. But I think anytime you bring unconventional tactics and strategies, you're going to throw someone for a loop. You're going to confuse. You're going to slow the systems down. You're going to do some things that are revolutionary and get other people to open their minds and go, "Oh, wait a sec, you can do a spinning back kick and land it in a real fight? Dang, let me practice that." I thought that was just for the movies. And you start to, look outside of yourself. And I think that's what makes martial arts so cool, is that you could see the development of it, or that's the way it should happen anyway. And I think that combat at any level, if you're not getting better, you're getting worse. And I think that's what's really exciting about something like Bitcoin, is you've seen it become this behemoth, and it's changing, and it's getting into territories that I mean, I myself, I didn't see as possibilities. So I love that. I love seeing things evolve. That is, if I'm not evolving as a person, if I'm not evolving and improving as a person, as a martial artist, as a father, as a husband, then I'm doing something wrong. So I think that's something that has really transferred over to my life, and it's something that I try to keep my eye out on different things, and whether it's a technology or a sport or a new way of looking at things. I'm curious in those aspects.
Yeah, that's interesting because as you were saying that, I was like thinking about Paul Tudor Jones, who said earlier this year that he's putting a lot of money into Bitcoin. One of the things that I learned about him as I found out about him and what he did is that he's actually, like most investors in that category are kind of like what you said. They're doing what everyone else is doing.
Mm-hmm.
But he's actually one of the few people that's able to do something different and be successful in it, which is why it was such a big deal that he invested in Bitcoin, because he's one of those people that everyone tries to imitate as a result.
Right. And it's amazing. The same thing with Michael Saylor, MicroStrategy,
Mm-hmm.
where you're like, man, these guys are really, putting their balls on the line here. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah, isn't it? He's already made like $30 million for MicroStrategy just in the last week.
It's so cool. It's so cool.
You mentioned something about like trying to figure out how to understand, and you also mentioned that you taught. Can you speak a little bit more about how you impart that to other people? Because this is a problem that everyone faces in Bitcoin. Is you have a relative that doesn't understand it, and they go, explain Bitcoin to me. And you try with everything that you can, and they still don't get it at the end. So I'd love to get some insights from you, because it sounds like you've done a good deal of teaching, at least with something that I certainly don't know that much about jiu-jitsu, but I would love to get your take on that.
Oh, for sure. So Jimmy, and the next, I have two schools, or I had two schools. I have one in Boston called Florian Martial Arts Center, and I had another one in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And I had the experience of teaching a lot. And I think I know I can reach more people by doing an online thing. So that's kind of where I'm going to be heading with that is, teaching online. I have the ability to reach so many more people, right? Now, if I'm going to be doing it and it's not in person, how do I come up with a system that is so different from the way things are traditionally taught? And how do I communicate that? Well, what I've been trying to do is essentially I've been basically trying to teach myself, and I've been writing a lot down over the years. I've been doing jiu-jitsu, I guess, almost 25 years now. And I wrote a lot of stuff down. But I think the most important thing we can do to break things down for ourselves and for others is by not getting the right information, but we can get the right information by asking the right questions. So I think the right questions is what's going to point us to all the good stuff. And sometimes it's not just one question. So I think repeatedly asking the right questions of saying, like, say, for example, in jiu-jitsu, well, if I need to take you down, what are the forces at play that allow me to take you down? Okay, so I need to get on the inside of, let's say, some kind of your limbs. I need to get some kind of connection with my body and yours. And I need to understand what are the different directions that I need to head to achieve it based on the relation of my body and yours. So I think, something like that, for example, is, okay, well, there's a lot of invisible forces at play. What are those forces, and how do we take advantage of those forces? And, looking at something as simple as, okay, if I am standing on the floor and I'm not floating in space, how do I use the floor to maximize my ability to put force on you and control you? And understanding what your opponent can do to you as well, and breaking those things down to, I think, a process that is simple can actually be quite complicated, because you have to cut through all the crap and all the noise and try to get to what you're looking at in its most simplistic terms. What are the main forces at play, and how can I really simplify that and understand that the best that I can? Yeah.
That's interesting because, like to me, that sounds very logical. Like you gotta figure out where your point of contact is, where your leverage is, and
Hmm.
like what force you can expend and what force they're expending and all that. That sounds very logical to me. But it feels like, like if I'm in front of somebody and I'm about to punch them or they're about to punch
Sure.
me, that just feels very different than like sort of the academic area of the classroom. So how
Right.
do you connect those two things?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think a lot of it is understanding that it really is an information game and that
Mm-hmm.
the person who controls that force will win the game,
Mm-hmm.
or win that exchange anyway. So I think that you must have a faith, you must have a trust in what you're doing, and also you have to be testing that repeatedly. And I think that's where training comes in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, unfortunately, for a lot of people who train in martial arts or jiu-jitsu, they go in with the idea of winning first and not learning and understanding first.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing that, a lot of times you don't make any moves because, let's say, Jimmy, you and I were about to get into a self defense situation, and you look like a big scary guy that can hurt me. Guess what? I can avoid getting hurt or avoid being defeated by just running the hell away from you. And be like, well, what happened in your fight against Jimmy? Can he be like, yeah, he could beat me, man. He could do anything to me. But the real story is that I just completely ran away from him.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have to throw myself into the fire. I need to engage into a fight or a grappling situation to really understand what's going on. So you kind of need to be thrown into the mechanics of what's going on, and then be present enough to feel what's going on and then rectify those situations or improve those situations as you go. So instead of like, and there's literally, Jimmy, it's just like chess in that there are so many different combinations of moves and counter moves that you can do to each other. So, okay, well, instead of trying to memorize all of those games and all of those techniques and all of those moves and counter moves, what if I can group everything and understand the basis and how each of those things work? Now I can understand, instead of understanding a series of movements, I understand the movement behind all of those things. And I can group, let's say, 1,000 moves into these two or three concepts. And I can get another million moves and group that into two or three concepts. And I can get another group of a million moves and put that under two or three concepts. And it's way more approachable and way easier for me to understand what's going on.
Mm. So sort of like abstracting some of these what looks very complicated into something that is much more approachable and understandable. Is that?
Yeah, exactly.
Now, yeah, and that's certainly something we try to do in Bitcoin. But unfortunately, the difficulty, at least in explaining Bitcoin to a lot of people, is that they don't know what money is, right? Like
Right.
that seems to be a bit like they think they know, but they don't know. And I imagine it's very similar in something like fighting or jujitsu or something like that. Is that people think they know how to fight, actually they don't. Something like
No,
that.
100%. 100%. I think that, like, everybody in general, like, thinks that in some way, shape, or form. Like, I feel like the intelligent person, they understand, like, hey, I'm in a car right now. It's probably not a good idea for me to get out and fight this person, like, but like, for other people who aren't really thinking and not really utilizing their brain on a daily basis, it's like, people think that, like, there's no repercussions for getting into a fight with someone, where it's like, you could run into an actual professional fighter. You can, and me as a professional fighter, I can run into someone who has a deadly weapon like a knife or a gun or any of those things. Like, it's just not, that's not a good situation to be in. And I think it does really come down to educating people, right? And it's like, I don't know. I think that was my big issue, Jimmy, in what you identified, is that, did I really understand what money was, 10 years ago or whatever it was? I'm not sure I did. It was just kind of like this agreement and this faith that, okay, this paper thing that I'm handing to you is real. And, that's it. Or here's this credit card and these guys will pay you. And those guys will send money to their credit card that will pay you and put this imaginary number in your account. I don't, so I think that by almost asking the question of asking people, what is your definition of money? Well, this is kind of what money is, and this is how we can redefine it.
Mm. Yeah. The other thing that you said that was really interesting to me is that you say that most people are more focused on winning and not learning. And we've definitely seen that in Bitcoin. People are like, you know what? I doubled my money. I'm out. Like I'm very,
Yeah,
very happy. I won.
totally.
Instead of actually learning and figuring out what this is and then taking full advantage of the innovation that it is. In what way do you feel like we can learn from, I guess, fighting, jujitsu, the experience of UFC, which has gone essentially from like a fringe sport to completely mainstream at this point?
I think what's exciting is the fact that, like any technology, whether it's Bitcoin or martial arts, it is constantly adapting and evolving, and it's hard to control or set your mind on exactly how you see it, because a lot of these things end up expanding and become these other entities within itself. And I kind of see that with Bitcoin and the potential for it,
Mm,
you know, and I think that understanding that it might not evolve the way you want,
mm,
and a lot of times that ends up being like this organic life form in a way.
mm, mm,
And you almost have to just be present and kind of understand where it's going and what the potentials of it. In some cases, you need to be ahead of it and lead these technologies. But in a lot of other cases, I think you need to be present and aware of what it's turning into as well.
mm,
Because there's a lot of different directions that things like martial arts can go. And just because you're evolving doesn't necessarily mean you're headed in the right direction. And I think that that's a common problem you see in engineering. It's a common problem you see in martial arts. It's like, oh, look at this, I'm getting better. That person that beat me before, I can beat now. But when you go back and look at the fight, you're like, man, you didn't do anything. You didn't
mm.
do anything during the fight. You only created like these defensive mechanisms that were boring, that really kind of didn't do a whole lot. In some cases, that's a good thing. In other cases, it can be a very harmful thing where you're not advancing anywhere. You're not making it better. And I think it's a common issue, I think, and anytime we try to evolve something, just because we evolve something doesn't mean that we're headed in the right direction, or that's the long-term good thing.
Yeah, I think you just described like most altcoins out there. Just
Right,
like
exactly.
they're evolving in a direction that doesn't make any sense. And they're like, oh, we could do this better. And it's like, no one really cares about that aspect.
Exactly. Just focus your attention on what we got, and we can make that better. And it's true. I think that like Bitcoin has established itself as such a strong player, and everything is there. Again, in my kind of eyes, I feel like everything is there to where you can layer things and make things stronger, and create something that is extremely special. I think it already is that, but I think the potential is so much more, and I'm really excited to see how it adapts and evolves.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to touch on is sort of like UFC's rise, right? From when you were on the Ultimate Fighter to now, it's a completely different ballgame because it was a struggling thing for a while, and then it just absolutely exploded. What do you think happened to make that happen? Because like that's the path I think everyone wants Bitcoin to go on, is sort
Absolutely.
of like UFC's rise that we've seen. So what do you think happened, and what can Bitcoiners do to make that happen?
I was lucky enough to kind of really see it happen. And,
Mm.
without trying to pat myself on the back, I think the Ultimate Fighter really was one of those keys. It's like, how do we get that? How do we get this in front of as many eyes as possible? And how do we get them to see it and understand it and get familiar with the fighters and kind of have this vested interest? And I think, the UFC did a great job early on of telling the stories of the fighters. And I think that's what the Ultimate Fighter did so well, was that, there were here these 16 fighters in the house. And I guarantee you, one of those fighters, or maybe more, a lot of other people who are watching could associate themselves with at
Mm,
least one of those fighters,
mm,
or at least want to watch one of those fighters anyway.
mm.
And I think, I think that's what was done extremely well. Was they took their time, they let things build up, they got some very good network deals. It started with Spike TV, and then it ended up being on Fox Sports, and then it went from Fox Sports, it went to ESPN. So they've been building up into more and more high profile media, which I think has been huge. Now I think they're in a weird space where they have so many fights going on where they can't kind of um, the narration of what fight is important and what fight you should watch and which one is a big one and which one is just a little one is kind of hard for people to decipher right now, because I don't think the stories of the fighters are being told as much. But it certainly has evolved into a much, much bigger sport. I mean, when you hear that the UFC is being purchased for $4.2 billion from where it started, which was like almost bankrupt, it's amazing to see that. And I think that, similar to Bitcoin, and it sounds silly, but we are a silly, silly group of individuals
Mm,
where maybe, a Bitcoin billionaires movie is going to be the thing that gets everybody aware of, or more people aware of what this Bitcoin thing really is. It sounds silly, but like maybe it's something like that, and getting a lot of viewership, or getting eyeballs on Bitcoin and what it is and what it means and things like that is what it's gonna take to um, get people to really look outside of what their perspective of money is. So I think, yeah, I think just doing things like that, whether it's a Bitcoin commercial during the Super Bowl, or I don't know, people talk about these things, but it needs to be communicated in much more simpler terms, I think, as well. And
mm,
it's not something that's going to be told in a 30-second commercial, that's for
mm.
sure. A lot of the things that are worth understanding, um, it's not going to be this quick 10-second tutorial. It's just not. Bitcoin is much more than that. So I think, but kind of communicating the basics of what you said, of like kind of comparing it to what money was and how it can be, I think is a good place to start.
Yeah, it's interesting because jujitsu is so popular now, in large part because of the UFC,
Totally.
and sort of like it had a market to prove itself versus other martial arts.
Yes.
Whereas like 2008, like very few people knew jujitsu, or what it was, and you yourself actually discovered it. So, I mean, it sounds like that's where you want Bitcoin to be, or to sort of like prove itself and show people that it's actually much, much better. Like, is
Definitely.
that the direction?
I think so. And I think, listen, I think people are already seeing it. Once
Mm,
people, see that these things can happen, like with,
mm,
the financial crisis in 2008. And, I think that's why, these times in COVID, this is actually a great opportunity for things like Bitcoin and other technologies to emerge, because you start to see that, what, a lot of this stuff, it's not working. Wait a second, where are they printing this money from?
mhm,
Where are these trillion dollars of stimulus coming from? Oh,
mm,
wait, they can just print it?
mm,
Wait, what does that mean? So does that mean the dollar's going to go? So it's almost like these events that are happening I hope this is the case, that it's getting people to ask these questions that are very difficult, and
mm,
getting people to realize that we are not in a good spot right now. And
mm,
I think Bitcoin is one of the technologies that can save us and allow people to actually start saving money, and start taking some power back. And I think those questions kind of need to be posed by people. And a lot of times, it's like the best way of teaching someone is getting them to experience that thing for themselves.
mm,
And the unfortunate thing is, a lot of people are going to learn some very hard financial lessons. I think they already have, but it's only the beginning. I mean, there's so many small businesses that have been run out of business because of COVID, and will continue to do so because of COVID. So I think it's going to get people to start to ask those very difficult questions, and start to understand, like, what is financial responsibility and how can I attain that for myself?
Mm. Yeah. So yeah, you've mentioned a lot of this stuff. The one thing I want to sort of circle back to, which you mentioned near the beginning, is that Bitcoin and like jujitsu and a lot of this stuff. It means being involved in your own destiny, right? I love the way you put that. Instead of sort of blaming other people and sort of like having your agency taken away from you. Uh,
Totally.
in what way do you think? I mean, do you think society is going towards that? Because right now, in the time of COVID, we're in many ways sort of restricted in what we can do, and we have sort of like a very big government apparatus that's trying to sort of like control us in many different ways. Like, do you see us going more towards a path of liberty and freedom instead of this? Oh, they'll take care of it, and we can blame them if things go wrong.
Geez, that's a tough one. I think that um, obviously it still remains to be seen. I would like to think that in this day and age of information and misinformation, that it's actually going to force people to really go out and get the right information and do the research in a way. I hope, it seems like right now, we're in this spot where anyone who believes anything can go out and get information to validate it, right? And I think
Mm-hmm.
that that can be a very dangerous thing. But if you're doing the right kind of research, you want to get various perspectives and really do your due diligence. And I think that's what, for me, has taken me a long time in understanding or trying to understand Bitcoin the best that I can. Is like, okay, is this a pipe dream? Am I getting a one-sided viewpoint of Bitcoin, and is this all hopes and dreams, or is this legit? And the more I do research on Bitcoin, the more excited I get, and the more potential I see, and I see that it's actually more real, and it's more achievable. And so I think that people need to do their own work to really get a good grasp on things. Listening to someone, it can only get you so far. You have to go and do the work yourself. It's like we've grown up in this uh, place where my goal is not to get information on a subject. It's to pass a test and get the highest score that I can, and that's it. It's not to retain any information. It's not to really enlighten me and make me more aware of certain things. It's like, nope, pass the test, man, and move on. Pass the next test and move on. Keep going as quickly as you can. Just your whole goal is getting through these grades, or getting through this course, or getting through this class, and you know just showing up for something and not really being there to really want to learn isn't enough. I think that we need to entice people to be intellectually curious, really, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to get you to take in information or not, and get you to ask the right questions. It's I think that that's the biggest gift I think you can give someone is, besides information, is really intellectual curiosity. I think that's the most important thing. We have to constantly be asking ourselves these questions. Am I doing the right things? Is this the best way? Because I think as you dig deeper, you realize you can dig deeper all the time, all the time. I remember being like in a place where my jiu-jitsu would be like, oh man, now I really got it figured out. I'm doing good. Man, am I like, I'm really good. And I'm really getting the place. And then I roll with someone who is very, good in this specific area where I thought I was good. I go, oh man, I just got my ass kicked, or I just found out there's a big vulnerability in what I'm doing here. Oh, back to the drawing board. And so you can never kind of be in this place where I think you're overly comfortable. You have to constantly be in this space, I think, where you're constantly trying to fortify your position, and you're constantly trying to dig deeper and understand as much as possible. And I think Richard Feynman said it best, is like, what did he say? He said, understanding is an art, and not everyone is an artist. And I think that's something that really kind of hits home with me, of like, man, just keep trying to understand as much as possible. There's always more info out there.
Mm. I love how you put it. Like, sort of, there's this way of living where you're trying to improve yourself versus sort of going through the motions and okay, I get passed on to the next grade and so on. And I can't think of a better analogy than like the free market, right? Where you're constantly having to compete with other players and improve your product so that you can compete on the market. And that's what gives juice to life instead of this going through the motions, sort of almost a socialist existence where your path is set out for you and you do what they tell you and that's it. That just seems so dark to me.
100%. It's like I saw some meme like a couple months ago, and but it was true. It was like these. They had the lion that was caged up,
Mm,
and then they had the lion and its pride on a field,
mm,
and it said, "Which one would you rather be?" When you think about it, it's like a lot of people are kind of caged and they don't realize it, and they don't really care. It's like, hey, as long as I'm getting my meals and I know that I know where it's coming from. Like I'm good with that. I'm satisfied. But the reality is that like we are born to be free. We are born to be able to roam. We are born to be able to do a lot of these things, and we kind of get caught up in this system and we think that's that truth and that's what the only things we can do, and which is why it's so hard for people to break out of a way of thinking. We get so accustomed to it and we get so comfortable. And I think it's a very dangerous place to be. I really do in a lot of different ways. How can you bring innovation to the table if you just accept everything?
mm. And that seems to be a problem in the UFC as you're seeing it. Like, can you tell me more
Absolutely.
about like why people aren't trying to innovate and create something new or try something new? Is it fear of failure? What is it?
You know what? I think it is definitely fear of failure. I
Mm,
think that first of all, there's very few people that are trying to bring something new
mm,
because they want to know what works. They're like, okay, this is what works. I'm just going to go out there and copy that. I'm going to do what is a proven formula. I'm going to stick to that, and at least I can do that. And also, I can point the finger to that formula after I screwed it up and go, well, I was just doing that because I thought it worked, and they're the people that are doing it wrong, not me.
mm, mm,
Um, and I think that a lot of it has to do with how we were raised. And I've thought about this a lot as I have a 2.5-year old.
mm,
I think, well, I can't just give them information. I need to give them tools and teach them how to use these tools. That's the most important thing. Is like, how do I
mm,
give them right perspective to achieve success in life? Like, what are those things? Not just like, hey, here's money, now you're rich. Like that doesn't do anything. I mean, we've seen a lot of people who are really kind of ignorant and have a bunch of money, but and is that what success is? It's like,
mm,
well, how do we change the perspective and get people to look for ways to make things better and look for ways to innovate and ask questions and not be afraid to be to think outside the box, to be outside the box, to be an innovator and understand that all the good things are done by people who aren't doing what the status quo is. Like that's the only way you can elevate things is by really trying to do something different and doing something that is also going to benefit a lot of people. And I think a lot of that has to do with also having faith in yourself and believing in yourself, and also understanding that failures also lead to success. That
mm,
hey, maybe you went in the wrong direction, or maybe you were in the right direction, and you just need to make it a little bit better, or get people to understand it a little bit better, or be in front of the right people, or so there's so much there's so many things that can go wrong in that process, and I think that a lot of it has to do with not having faith in yourself and maybe not working hard enough. Like,
mm.
geez, man, I've been doing jiu-jitsu for 25 years and I feel like I'm just really figuring things out of how it works. Like, and I'm like, oh my God, all these other people that are supposed to be experts and supposed to be black belts and know what they're doing don't know what the hell they're talking about. And I think that's like, so much of this world is being run, or we're looking up to these people that don't necessarily know what the hell they're talking about. They're just kind of in a formula or repeating something that someone else has done. And I think there's a lot of value in that. And like we stand on the shoulders of giants, of course, and we could see further because of them. But now let's take it further. Let's truly take it further. And maybe we're even looking in the wrong direction still.
That's such an interesting thought. The whole idea that a lot of decision making comes from your ability to blame somebody else for that decision instead of, sort of trying something that's actually yours. But if you fail, you're going to get blamed. And like, to avoid blame, a lot of people end up, going down a path that might not be that great for them. And, they might have some success, but it's not what I guess you would call maybe artistry. It's not not creative. It's not adding something to the world.
Totally.
All right. Well, so we're coming up at the close of this hour. So a few more questions, just as a fan and stuff like that. I've been curious about. All right. So the UFC has done spectacularly well during this lockdown, whereas the NBA, the NFL, MLB, they've all done much worse. Why is that? What do you think is the difference between those?
I think a few things. I do think that Dana White and the UFC, they are not afraid to do things differently, number one. I think that they are willing to do whatever it takes to be successful, and also take advantage, of the fact that there weren't a whole lot of sports going on at the time. And for Dana, I know that he's always looking for ways to get more fans and to bring more people into the space. And I thought he saw that as an opportunity and not a crutch. And I think so many times we get stuck analyzing a problem and being in the problem as opposed to solving the problem. And I think they did a great job of being like, okay, we're in this situation. How do we get this? How do we get this to work? How can we pull this off? And I think like having that strong belief, and also, also having a big financial motivation of understanding, hey, we could really take advantage of getting new fans and getting on ESPN, and also whatever other financial stresses they have to make fights happen and make their money that they need to make. So I think there was that. I also think they did a good job of really trying not to inject a political conversation into everything. And I may take heat for this, but I think that there's a lot of other ways to kind of get involved into the political conversation. I think it's okay for individual players and fighters and things like that to talk about those things. That's absolutely, I think, cool and fine. But I think when the whole organizations kind of get behind it, they end up, I think, especially in this environment where I don't remember a time when we've been as divided as we are now. Is if you're going to invite a political conversation behind the whole league or behind a game or anything like that, I think you run the risk of really, separating a lot of other people from that event from happening. It's like, if people are seeing, whatever the political conversation is, or whatever the agenda is, I think you run the risk of ignoring a lot of other people, or basically rubbing them the wrong way. So I think that's kind of happened. I don't know. I think the UFC has done a good job in that way for the most part. I think they do make a lot of other political decisions that I think are kind of foolish, in some ways. And I know that Dana is friends with the president and things like that. But, I think being as neutral as possible, I think in a lot of ways, I think goes a long way. And it doesn't mean but that's just not their job. It's like their job is to run a sports league. So I think that sometimes leagues maybe forget about that in some ways. And I don't know.
Okay. Well, another question that just kind of popped in to my mind as you mentioned your 2.5-year-old son.
Daughter. I have a daughter.
Daughter.
Yes,
okay.
Yeah.
2.5-year-old.
Yes.
Like what are some things that you want to teach her to give her you mentioned like sort of like giving her the tools instead of like information. What are
Yeah.
some of those tools?
I think it's perfectly fine for them to make mistakes and for them to explore and for them to um, do things for themselves, and I think that sometimes in our attempts to make sure that they're safe and they have all these things and this and that we kind of inject ourselves way too much into a situation where it's almost like, if I tie her shoes all the time and if I dress her myself all the time, I don't give her the tools to be able to tie her shoes. I don't give her the tools to be able to pick out her clothes and put her clothes on properly and all those things. So I think like managing that aspect of not doing too much and not doing too little and trying to give them perspectives on doing things like, my wife's great with it, but like my daughter will want to grab a vacuum and start helping out, or like, I want to help mama cook, or I want to help her do this. And a lot of times we kind of like shun them. Like, I kind of wasn't really encouraged to do a lot of like backyard work, and they're like, no, 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 we can do this, Kenny. Just go away. You're only going to make things messy, and just to kind of run along. But I think there's tremendous value in kind of handing her the vacuum. Be like, you know what? She might not be doing the best job, but like, let her do it. Let her experience what it's like. Let her try to do those things, and let her, get up in her little tower and watch her mom cook and help her, hand an egg to her or do something, and hey, you know what? She's going to drop a lot of those eggs. She's going to throw flour around, and she's going to do a lot of those things, but it gets her involved. It gets her curious. And it allows them to make mistakes and do some cool things and feel like they're making accomplishments. So I think, obviously the basic analogy of it, right, is, teaching them how to fish and not just giving them fish, right? I think the more that we can do that, and obviously it needs to be age appropriate and what they can handle, I think is so important, because things aren't easy, and anything worth achieving isn't going to be easy. There's going to be a struggle, and there's going to be failures, and there's going to be, success, and the ways that we can get to keep pushing through those spaces and continuing to learn that success is, only defined by us, and we can keep pushing further and go further and go deeper, and just be as curious as we can throughout our life, because so many times, the answers that we have today are completely different tomorrow. So I think carrying that kind of intellectual curiosity is super important, and I think it's important for all of us.
Yeah, that whole mentality that you seem to have, I'm suspecting it probably existed before, getting into the UFC or whatever. But it feels very much like a warrior mentality. Like, I'm going to take on whatever comes at me and figure it out, rather than, okay, well, I'm gonna go, I don't know, go and hide in a corner or something like that.
I think that's super accurate, and I think there's a lot of things that are going to be coming our way that is chaotic and that is confusing and that is difficult. And I think the more that we can prove it to ourselves that we can achieve these things and we can be successful and that we can deal with hard times, that we know what adversity is like and we know what hard work is like, the more confidence we have in ourselves to be able to handle those difficult things. And I definitely think, the warrior mindset is one that can go a really long way, no matter whether you throw a punch or want to do martial arts or not. I think that's all within us, that we have survived to this point for a reason. And we just have to continue looking for those ways of not only to survive, but to thrive in whatever things that life throw our way.
Okay. Well, one last question before we go. Where do you think Bitcoin is 20 years from now? And,
oh my gosh.
And like, how do you think it affects your part of the world? And you can take that to mean whatever you want.
Wow. Okay. Well, I do think that Bitcoin will definitely be a much different thing than what we see right now. I think it will be kind of entrenched in our life, in how we pay and do the various transactions, whether it's buying a house, selling a house, buying a car, buying a piece of gum. All those things I think will look vastly different to us. I would think that various governments and various people would have strong positions in Bitcoin at that point. I would like to think that I would be happily retired with a stable income, or a stable nest of money, whatever that looks like. And I hope that a lot of other individuals that were maybe just trying to play catch up and just trying to keep their head above water are in a much different situation now, because they did believe and invest in Bitcoin. Yeah, I just see it in a completely different way, and I hope that it not only does that, but that it actually makes the world a more peaceful place. That because these governments aren't trying to keep up, or trying to because they're not devaluing currencies anymore, and because they're not scrambling to try to make their countries work, because of this Bitcoin, I feel like there's the possibility of it being a more peaceful place and not having to go to war. And so I think that there's a lot of potential for it. I hope that it continues in a positive light, and that just more education is out there on this technology.
All right. Where can people find you?
They can find me on social media at Kenny Florian on Twitter or Instagram, and at kennyflorian.com as well. And I will be having a YouTube channel up as well soon, and I'm going to be releasing a jiu-jitsu instructional, hopefully before the end of the year, but certainly in the next few months. So anyone who's interested on a basic level to learn what I was kind of talking about can do that. And I do a podcast on the UFC and mixed martial arts called the Anik and Florian podcast, and that's kind of everywhere that there's a podcast. And that's pretty much it, man. Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Bitcoin Fixes This. Kenny can be found at @KennyFlorian on Twitter and on kennyflorian.com. Until next time, fiat delenda est.